think Letitia just read you my origin myth. Thank you, Letitia. And I want to thank Susan Feller and the organizing committee for the conference for the opportunity to talk to you. I want to welcome you all to Washington, since this is where I live and work now. It's the home of the National Museum of the American Indian and, of course, the Smithsonian Institution. And it's very nice to have you all here. I remember I was at either the first or second ATOM conference, and let's just say it wasn't quite as big as this. So the growth of this organization is one of the most important things going on in Indian country as far as I'm concerned. And to see the expansion of interest, capacity, ability, and activity among the tribal archives, libraries, and museums is genuinely inspiring and creates an extraordinarily important resource. And I'll come back to that as we get into this. I probably don't have to explain to you about origin myths and imaginary Indians, but I will anyway. So a few months ago, my wife and I were in California, and we had a day to kill. We were in San Francisco, and she had read something about missions and decided we should go see one of these missions. Now, we'd been to one before, but it turns out there's one in Sonoma, California, which was kind of on our way to where we were headed next. And this one happens to be a state park. It's one of only two of the, I think there are several dozen of these missions scattered about California. This is one of only two that is not now in the possession of the Catholic Church and is in fact a state park. So we pull into Sonoma and park there at the town square, walk into this place, and there's a state park ranger at the door, and we paid our admission fee for a couple of bucks or something, and went in to look at the exhibition in there about the history of this mission. Had all sorts of things about the arrival of a particular landowner who became very wealthy by acquiring land. They didn't say who he was acquiring it from, of course, but he was developing land all around this mission. And then the church arrived, and they established this mission. And then it went on, and there was a little bit about Indians in there. They did acknowledge that the Indians were Christianized, that was the objective of the mission, and they were brought in, often against their will, and made to work on behalf of the church. So I'm thinking, well, it's not great, but it's not bad. And then we could hear children playing outside in the plaza of the mission. And so went to see what was out there. And we walk out, and there's obviously a couple of classrooms worth of kids out in the plaza doing these organized activities. And we noticed that their teachers and their chaperones were dressed in brown robes as if they were priests from the 18th century. Now it's starting to get a little weird. And then we kept looking and noticed that some of these, what turned out to be fourth graders, were dressed as Indians. Their parents had gone to the trouble of making them little costumes out of, grocery sacks or something, so they could look like Indians. So now it's becoming clear what's going on out here. And they were moving the kids from station to station. They were making candles and spinning wool, weaving baskets. I learned later that the California mission system is required content in the fourth grade in California. And this was this teacher and this school meeting that curricular requirement. This is the last time the schools, fourth grade, last time the schools are required to talk about the missions. And so another year of fourth graders come away thinking that it was fun to be an Indian in the missions. Now, I'm not saying we should be teaching fourth graders about rape and murder, but I don't think they should come away thinking that it was fun to be an Indian in the California missions. As I got to thinking about it later and associating it with some of the other work the museum's doing, I realized that this was the California origin myth that I was observing. And that California is a strange place, so many different transplants, hardly anybody is actually from California. And so they have to find a way to sort of create a civic identity for a place where everybody came from somewhere else. And so what they came up with was the mission system. For others, it was the gold rush, but the real origin story is the mission system. And this myth has all the characteristics of all other American origin myths, and that is the aggrandizement of some founding hero and the creation of imaginary Indians. And so in this case, the founding hero that they've created is Father Junipero Serra, who is soon to be made a saint by the Pope. In fact, about a week from today, right here in Washington. As we began looking into who Father Serra was and what his acts were, it became clear pretty quickly that he's not quite all that. He's not somebody who had some grand vision that he went out and pursued and executed, but rather was an effective church bureaucrat who was carrying out instructions from others and doing what he thought was right, but not a truly, certainly not the remarkable, benevolent figure that he was portrayed as. And by the way, his statue is in the Capitol as one of the two that California it gets to place in the Capitol Statuary Hall. The Indians are imaginary because, of course, they received Christianity and civilization with total good feeling and gratitude. So you can see how this California origin myth requires both the aggrandizement of a non-Indian hero and the creation of these imaginary Indians who are grateful for the arrival of civilization. Now, California is not alone, of course. Indeed, if we would go up to the Capitol and look at some of the art, we would see evidence of a number of other origin myths that the country is very fond of. You know the stories, we all do. First, there is, of course, the arrival of the Pilgrims. If you go into the Capitol Rotunda, there's one of the huge frescoes on the wall is called the Embarkation of the Pilgrims. So it's the Pilgrims getting on their boat and setting sail from Europe, destined for the New World. And so we know that pilgrims are a great part of the origin myth of the United States. The part we all know and that we really like is Thanksgiving, right? The first Thanksgiving. And we all know the story where the Pilgrims kind of had a tough winter, then the friendly Indian Squanto taught them how to grow corn, and they had a successful harvest and got together. They had a big feast with the Indians, threw the football around a little, and a good time was had by all. It was a wonderful story of racial harmony and of good people getting together to give thanks for what they had. Similarly, another of the frescoes in the Capitol Rotunda is the baptism of Pocahontas. Now, we all know the Pocahontas myth as well. We all know of the heroic John Smith and the nubile Pocahontas. We know about her because we've all seen her buckskin cocktail dress, which was made famous by the Disney Company. Now, what's ironic is, like all mythology, it has some basis in fact. There was, in fact, this Indian who greeted the Pilgrims. They think now his name was Tisquantum, not Squanto. And it turns out he wasn't quite so friendly. He was actually a very tragic figure. Someone who had. How many of you knew that Squanto spoke English when he first encountered the Pilgrims? Not that many, right? because we didn't learn that. They didn't have that in my school book when I was in school. He spoke English. So he walks into their camp and says, "Hey, what's up?" And they're and everybody's going, "Well, what's this Indian guy doing? I mean, how does he know?" Turns out Squanto had been kidnapped twice. He had been to Europe twice and made his way back 2 times. When he got back home the second time, unfortunately, his entire village had been wiped out by a smallpox epidemic. And so he was looking for somebody to hang with. He was a man without a country at that point. Walks into their village speaking English. I didn't know any of that when I got out of school. But that tells me a whole different story than the one about Squanto, the friendly Indian who welcomed the Pilgrims and their civilization. Similarly, Pocahontas. First of all, John Smith was 29 years old when he met Pocahontas, who was 11. So it wasn't a love story, we hope. And in fact, she was a child. She died at age 23, having had a single child by her husband, John Rolfe, an Englishman who had taken her back to England, where she died of some disease. That story about her saving John Smith from being executed by her father, Powhatan, there's only one place that story shows up in the record, and it was in the largely fictional book that was written by John Smith himself. And so historians are generally agreed now that that never happened. But it's a good story, right? And it's a good origin myth. And so we like it. In fact, we love it, right? America loves its origin myths, and it loves its imaginary Indians, the ones who yielded gratefully to the arrival of civilization, even if it meant turning on their own people. Unfortunately, Americans are less fond of real Indians because we raise troubling issues of history, morality, national identity. We have all sorts of problems. We don't wear buckskin cocktail dresses. We don't teach them to grow corn. We don't do those things for them anymore. And so it's easy to understand why they prefer imaginary Indians. And if you look at, for example, the people who insist that naming the Washington football team by a racial slur referring to Indians is actually honoring us, they kind of mean it. They really believe that at some level. But what they're honoring are those imaginary Indians that they've created. They're not that interested in honoring real Indians. In fact, they'll go so far as to say, well, look at you. You're not a real Indian. You're wearing a suit. And I think, you wouldn't want to see me in a breechcloth, it's better for all of us this way. But you see the impact that the mythology and the imaginaries have in how people perceive, and that means that we don't have real problems, we don't have real issues, we don't have real governments, we don't have all of these things that we all know we do have and that we're trying to make work for us. And so imaginary Indians are fun and real Indians are messy. We have to find a way to change these narratives, and museums, archives, and libraries play an extraordinarily important role in this effort. And I would urge you, don't doubt. I mean, these are powerful stories, right? They've been around for a long time, and people really, really like them. But don't doubt that they can be changed. And there are examples just in our lifetimes. When I was a kid, there was no question whatsoever that Columbus was like the ultimate hero, and that he had discovered America. And it's true there were some Indians here, but they weren't really doing anything, and they were, picking berries, hunting deer, that sort of thing. So Columbus discovered America. Interestingly enough, when the Columbus quincentennial came along in 1992, that's when his reputation took a big dive, because everybody started going, well, what about this Columbus guy? And then they learned he was a murderer and a slaver and a thief and all of these different things. And so suddenly, you know, if you talk to the kids that are coming out of public education now, they'll tell you they're not big fans of Columbus. I mean, it's still out there. The old sticky Columbus myth is still out there, but it's eroded, and Columbus is no longer the unvarnished hero that he was when I was a kid. Same thing with Custer. When I was a kid, you know, Custer was like the ultimate American hero who died in the name of promoting civilization and all that nonsense. But if you read any popular history of Custer now, man, they got nothing good to say about the guy. So we see that these, as sticky as these myths are, they can be changed, and they can be changed in two ways. One is through continued good scholarship. It's really scholarship that provides the ammunition for taking these sorts of stories down and showing what the problems are. But the other is our advocacy, and have no doubt about that. Our advocacy for a different narrative is critical, and it's very difficult for people to say, you Indians don't know what you're talking about, when we're talking about our own stories. They'll say it, and they still do it, but it's harder, and certainly people of goodwill are going to listen to what we have to say. I think that's in large part the whole theory behind the National Museum of the American Indian, is to give Indians a place to say what they have to say. And the fact that it was established by the Congress itself and placed at the foot of Capitol Hill is basically, and is clearly a statement that we're ready to hear what you have to say, and we're going to do our best, you know, to absorb that and make it a part of our national narrative. At the same time, we shouldn't doubt the durability of these kinds of myths, and that if they've been flipped once, they can be flipped back. And so we have to be very vigilant about these sorts of things and really seize opportunities to set the record straight. And finally, I think it's important that we do so with a generous spirit. And I've come to the point of view that these folks who have these strange ideas about Indians come by them honestly. They don't know any better. In fact, they have been taught that these things are true about Indians by what should be the most reliable sources, by their teachers, by their school. Their formal education system has told them that these things are true. And so why shouldn't they believe them? And so we have to be generous and forgiving, I think, and realize that not only have they been misled, we've all been misled by what shows up in our history books. At the NMAI, there are two initiatives I want to tell you about that really are intended to attack this phenomenon. First, we're working on a series of historical exhibitions. The first to go in was Nation to Nation, and that is our exhibition about the history of treaties between the United States and the American Indian nations. And that went in a little over a year ago. More recently, we installed an exhibition called The Great Inca Road. Now, these exhibitions are intended to attack, mostly indirectly, but sometimes directly, some of the ideas that people bring into the museum. For example, in Nation to Nation, we make a point of showing that the Indian nations were making treaties with each other far before the arrival of Europeans. And so the notion of diplomacy was not a new idea to the native nations. And when the Europeans arrived, they had partners in diplomacy that they treated as equal, and whose protocols they respected. And so when George Washington made his treaty in 1794 with the Haudenosaunee, he knew that protocol required that he commission a wampum belt to be presented to the Haudenosaunee. And it's one of the more elaborate belts that are around. It's actually called the Washington Belt. And I'll tell you a little funny story because I got a little time. So I went to the Haudenosaunee and said, you know, we want to do this big exhibition. And you know, we know that you now have the Washington Belt, and we'd love to borrow it and put it on display, even for a little while at the museum. And after a lot of conversation, and it couldn't have been any nicer, and we ate a lot together and talked and just had a good time, they said, you know, a museum had this belt for a very, very long time. How are we, now that we got it back, how are we to explain to our people we're going to give it to another museum? I couldn't argue with that. So, but we have a replica of the Washington Belt, so you can see what it what it would look like. The Great Inca Road is an attack on the idea that the Americas were a wilderness. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, as our curators are fond of saying, in 1491, the Americas were a happening place. There were civilizations all over these two continents. There was no part of these two continents that was unknown and unclaimed in 1491. We have several upcoming exhibits that are going to explore similar sorts of ideas. One is about the Taino people, the people who greeted Columbus when he arrived in Dominica. The mythology is that the Taino are extinct, and you hear that all over the place, which would come as an enormous surprise to the many thousands and thousands of people who identify themselves as Taino. So we're very interested in that phenomenon and want to show this cultural continuity and the astonishing resilience of identity, even over these 500 years. We're going to do a major exhibition on boarding schools. That requires no explanation. We will do a permanent exhibition called Ancestors, once again attacking the myth of wilderness, and it will be a survey of pre-contact civilizations throughout the Americas. An exhibition called Contact, where we examine two things. One is the depopulation of the Americas after contact, and this loss of humanity is simply unprecedented in human history, and nothing on that scale has taken place since. At the same time this was going on, another phenomenon known as the Columbian Exchange was underway, and we intend to show how the knowledge and wealth of the Americas changed the world. And the idea is we're going to restore Native America to world history. If you read any of the old world history texts, we're lucky if there's a mention of the Incas and the Aztecs, but no credit is given for the dramatic impact of Native wealth, labor, and knowledge on the rest of the world after contact. We're working on an exhibition called Native New York. Everybody knows the origin myth for New York, right? $24 for Manhattan. So we'll take that one down too. And then we're going to do an exhibition that we're calling Americans. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, and where we're actually going to confront the origin myths themselves. And so we want to meet our visitors where they are, acknowledge that these are the things you know about. The first Thanksgiving, Pocahontas, the Trail of Tears, Little Bighorn. And so we'll tell them a story in a way they've probably never heard it before and see what they make of it. And if we succeed, I want those visitors saying two things as they leave the gallery. First is, I didn't know that. And even more importantly, I want them saying, why didn't I know that? How is it that I got the story so wrong? And so I'm looking forward to that exhibition. Equally important is we want to take the scholarship that goes into these exhibitions and turn them into materials that are readily usable by teachers in classrooms. And we call this the National Education Initiative. John Hayworth and Ed Schupman are going to do a session later today about the National Education Initiative. But through this method of reaching into the schools, we hope to prevent yet another generation, not next year, not 5 years from now, but one day, to prevent another generation of California fourth graders from believing that the missions were fun for the Indians. So we really are out to change popular understandings about Native Americans. And it's not a job just for us, although we have one resource that Indian country has never had available to it before, and that is the credibility of the Smithsonian. You all know that if the Smithsonian says it, it must be true. Honest. What is fortunate is that most people do believe that, and we intend to take advantage of that, and to show people that yes, what we say here is true. They will assume that it's true. That's a very powerful brand, and it's an asset that Indian country has never had before. And this is our way of using it to the advantage of Indian country. But as I say, it requires the participation of all of us to continue to tell these stories, to push back on what we know to be the incorrect version of these stories, and to give our friends, our learners, our visitors the information that they need to get these things right. And I just believe deep in my heart that if that information is correctly presented, that creates a very different environment when people begin to believe in real Indians and to understand who we are and what we want. That's a more receptive environment for progress and for tribal nations to meet their aspirations in the United States. So thank you very much for what you do, and I look forward to spending the rest of the day with you.